The year is 1876, and the river breathes like a sleeping animal. In the hour before dawn, a huddle of cypress trees hold their breath while the Foundry pulls its first lungful of air. The Winslow brothers call the furnace Mother, as if she, not they, will decide what is born in fire and what will never be named. In the wet light, iron smells like blood. Steam lifts from the slough and turns to a veil, and in that veil you can almost see faces, those who were carried here by debt, by war, by water, by the simple need to place a hand on something hot, so that it might form a shape in the coal. Men gather, palms scarred, shirts damp with a humidity that refuses to be tamed. A bell rope hangs idly from its beam, a lazy serpent, its tongue made of bronze that slept as ore for 1,000 years below some other parish's silent dirt. Jonah Winslow walks the line of molds the way a priest walks pews, checking for the soft defects that become hard truths if you let them through the pore. Elias, older by a breath and harder by a mile, lifts a ladle and looks down as if into a sky reversed. Stars thick as slag, constellations buckling under their own heat. Someone mutters that iron remembers. The voice carries, and nobody admits to owning it. It's the kind of sentence that takes hold like a seed under a fingernail. Irritation first, then infection, then a small garden of fear. The pour begin. Fire moves like an argument through the room, and the molds drink until they can take no more. Outside, the river rouses, a long muscle turning, and a heron steps with the indifference of something that has already seen the end of the story. In the first cooling hiss, something strange rises, not sound, not steam, but the feeling that grief has a metallurgy, that sorrow can be alloyed, that the weight of what we do to one another does not stay only in our heads. It goes somewhere. It takes shape. It waits. The Winslow brothers arrived as the war's shadow was still visible in the slouch of the people. Jonah carried a blackened tool chest, each handle worn to the smoothness of a river stone. Elias brought nothing but a stiff ledger book and the air of a man accustomed to exactness. They chose their ground where the bayou curled in on itself, catching driftwood and forgotten things. The land was half swamp, half stubborn earth, the kind that resists fence posts and swallows boots whole if you linger too long. Yet here they drove pilings deep enough to hold a roof of tin and a chimney that leaned like a man unwilling to admit fatigue. By the first month's end, the Foundry was breathing slow, heavy breaths from a chimney mouth that stained the clouds. They poured plow points for the cane fields, stove doors for the kitchens, rollers with jagged teeth for the mills. Wages drew men from every edge of the parish, freedmen who carried calluses like second skin, Irish laborers with salt still in their clothes, and river folk whose eyes stayed restless even in stillness. At first it seemed practical, even noble, iron as the cure for hunger, for debt, for war's quiet ruin. But late at night, when the men had gone and the fire banked low, Jonah would lean in the doorway, the bayou fog curling against his boots, and watch how the mist hesitated near the roofline as though deciding whether to go in. "You ever think about the past, Jonah?" Elias asked once, without looking up from his ledger. "All the time," Jonah replied. "I just don't live there." Still, neither spoke much of where they'd come from. In a town like this, silence is its own confession. By the time the cypress leaves had turned brittle, the nights felt longer than the days, as if time itself was losing faith in the clock. And though no one could yet say why, the townspeople began to glance at the Foundry with that same guarded expression they once saved for strangers with guns. Something between weariness and respect, like watching a sleeping dog whose teeth you've heard in dreams. Louisiana's air eats flame the way swamp eats a fence post, slowly, steadily, utterly. It doesn't snatch heat, it smothers it, coaxing embers into surrender the way water wears down stone. The Winslows, stubborn as the mules that dragged their coal, had learned to coax fire like a living thing with moods, feed it with patience, dry cordwood laid in careful tiers, coal kept under rusting sheets of tin so the greedy rain could not claim it before the furnace could. The morning of the first great pour began under a pewter sky. The commission was for a cane mill upriver, massive crushing rollers, each tooth honed to a promise of yield. The molds lay waiting, packed so tight that the cope and drag kissed along their edges, lips rehearsing goodbyes they would never say aloud. Men worked in murmured rhythm, tamping sand, checking seams, spitting tobacco into the dark corners of the floor. When the iron came to temperature, the furnace shuddered and bloomed. Jonah called the pour with a single nod, and molten metal spilled from the ladle in a glowing ribbon. The sprues hissed and swallowed. The risers rose as if some buried thing were filling its lungs for the first time. It should have been unremarkable. But when the mold was broken and the first roller dragged free, the men stepped back in unison. A palm, not etched, not chiseled, born into the cooling skin of iron itself. Fingers splayed wide, the heel of the hand pressed as if against some invisible barrier. "You touched this before casting?" Jonah asked, eyes fixed on Lefebvre, who'd rammed that section of sand. Lefebvre shook his head, didn't so much as breathe on it. Elias came closer, spectacles fogging in the damp heat. "Vent floor," he pronounced. The words hung, weightless and unconvincing. No one laughed. The roller was crated and sent on its way, but the air in the shop changed after that, the way a river's current changes when someone speaks a name it has been keeping. 3 days later, the second pour came out with something stranger still. A bead of metal no bigger than a thumbnail cooled into a perfect coil, delicate as a woman's hair wound on a fingertip. Too fine to have endured that heat, too perfect to dismiss as accident. "That's not from the mold, Ephraim," the young apprentice whispered. Jonah didn't answer. That evening, the men lingered at the pump longer than usual, scrubbing hands until the skin shone raw. Not because anyone had told them to, but because it felt wrong to carry that day home on their skin. In the ledger, Elias wrote only 2 rollers, delivered on schedule. But Jonah's gaze on the molds began to change, slower, heavier, as if each hollow in the sand was a sentence in a language he almost understood. Later that week, Jonah found himself standing alone in the shop at dusk. The light through the high windows had gone the color of spoiled milk, and the furnace was banked low. The rollers sat along the far wall like obedient animals, their teeth catching what little light there was. He laid his palm against one, not the marked one, another, and felt only chill. Yet the sensation that followed was not cold exactly. It was recognition. Behind him the bayou fog was curling in at the open door, slow and deliberate. "You're staring at nothing." Elias's voice came from the shadows, though he hadn't lit a lamp. Jonah didn't look back. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe it's looking back at me." The furnace gave a low pop, like a bubble bursting deep underwater. And in the silence that followed, the 2 brothers stood there, one watching the molds, the other watching his brother, while in the cooling iron, the day's heat retreated, taking something with it. The first echo was not a sound, it was a gesture. It happened on a wet Thursday, the kind where the sky seems unable to commit to day or night, and the damp crawls into the lungs before it finds your clothes. The furnace was running low, the air inside the foundry tasting faintly of coal and river moss. That morning's casting had been for a stove door, a plain order, unremarkable in size or craft. The metal had been poured, cooled, and struck free from the sand. By dusk, the rain was coming down in fine, steady needles drumming on the tin roof. Jonah leaned on a beam, watching the heat fade from the last few castings, when the thing happened. The stove door swung shut. Not the slow, accidental settle of weight, but a deliberate close as though a hand had pressed it firmly, sealing whatever was inside. The latch clicked, sharp and final. Elias, head bent over his ledger, didn't even look up. "Draft'll do that," he said, scratching another neat column of figures. "No draft," Jonah murmured. Ephraim, the 16-year-old apprentice, grinned from where he was sweeping slag. His smile was too large for the dim room. "I heard it," he said. "Heard it breathe first." Jonah's head turned. "Breathe?" "Like a cough," Ephraim replied, but softer now, as if realizing how foolish it might sound in the retelling. In the cooling, right before it moved, that night, the weather grew heavier, and the clouds piled above the bayou like slow-moving animals. Lightning stitched brief, crooked seams across the horizon. By midnight, the storm laid its long hand over the parish, and one of the men, a moulder named Garrity, failed to return home. Morning revealed a shop slick with silver threads of rainwater that had slipped through the roof. The air smelled of burnt metal and wet rope. Jonah found the ladle lying tilted against the forge wall, its spout pointing toward nothing. That angle was a mistake Jonah would never permit. On the ground near the furnace there was a smear of soot. At first glance it might have been a spill, the kind left by a boot heel dragged carelessly across the floor, but when the light caught it, the shape was clearer, the curve of an open mouth. Lips drawn back in surprise as if caught in the moment before speech. No one mentioned Garrity's name aloud that morning. In the days that followed, the oddities multiplied. Not grand, theatrical things, no slamming doors or fiery apparitions, but smaller, persistent disturbances. The kind that deepen unease precisely because they are so small and so constant. A plow point, fresh from cooling, carried a faint vibration when touched, not heat, but a tremor, like a throat holding back a word. Jonah tested it himself, fingertips grazing the metal, and pulled back faster than he meant to. The bell clapper for a small church order emerged from the mold with a mottled pattern around its waist. Under closer inspection, the marks formed a loop of circles, evenly spaced. The resemblance to a rosary was uncanny enough to unsettle even those who'd never been devout. Ephraim, sweeping again, muttered, "Things remember here." Jonah, who might have chastised him for idleness any other day, only said, "Don't tell the others that." The parish had known other hauntings, though it didn't often call them that. The war had left chairs forever empty at kitchen tables, debts had stolen land as quietly as rivers steal soil. Ghosts in the South are often less about rattling chains than about the long echoes of a name unspoken. So the men did not shout haunted, not yet. They were careful with their stories, trading them in the low tones one might use to speak of a sickness still unnamed. By the third week, even Elias, who worshipped order, who trusted numbers to deliver him clean through the fog, began lingering in the doorway after the day's work. His posture was one of listening, to the cooling of cast iron, to the soft settling of sand molds. "Anything?" Jonah asked one night. Elias shook his head. Then, after a pause, "I think it still wants to talk." Perhaps that was the most unsettling thing of all, the suggestion that the Foundry, with all its beams and bricks and sweat, was not merely a place where iron was shaped. It was becoming an instrument, and grief, as it often does, was learning how to make itself heard. The order came from the chapel down the road, a squat, whitewashed building, whose steeple leaned as if bowing to the river. Its pastor was a thin man with a voice sharp as a courtroom's gavel. Every sermon a carefully arranged indictment against sin. His prayers sounded less like pleas and more like legal arguments with God. Jonah approached the commission with an attention he rarely gave to people. Bronze, more temperamental than iron, required a gentler coaxing, heat held steady, sand rammed with hands that knew when to yield. The pour went clean, the metal flowing smooth and full into the mold's hidden cavity. When the bell was freed from its sandy womb, it was almost beautiful. The shoulder unbroken, the lip perfectly true, the crown shaped to take its yoke without a murmur of complaint. The brothers stared at it in a way they did not stare at people. They hoisted it with pulleys and curses, muscles straining against hemp rope. The sun, low and hazy in the swamp air, caught in the curve of bronze like a coin in a cupped hand. And when at last they set it swinging from its beam and let the clapper fall, the sound moved out across the parish in a single round note, clean, uncomplicated, with a warmth that could gather children in from the riverbank the way a mother calls them for supper. 3 nights later, the moon hung thin, a sly silver grin among scattered clouds. Somewhere in that boundary between waking and sleep, the parish heard the bell. 3 strikes, evenly spaced, measured. No rope moved. The men who lived within earshot woke into that stunned silence that follows an unexpected sound, the kind in which the world itself seems undecided. A fisherman's wife, eyes still glassy from sleep, said later she knew the number belonged to death. And 2 hours after dawn, the river proved her right. A body, water swollen, eyes half closed in the strange humility of the dead, surfaced where the bayou takes its slow leftward thought. No one knew if the bell had announced it or called it. The second time came 1 week later. Another night bent like a culvert under darkness. Again 3 strikes. Again unbidden. By now the town had stopped using the word coincidence. Conversations at the grocer's counter trailed off whenever the subject edged near. Mothers clutched their children's shoulders as they passed the chapel. The pastor climbed the belfry the next morning, sweat beading at his temples despite the coolness of early light. He scattered salt in the corners and placed his hand on the yoke as if feeling for a pulse. Perhaps, he said to Elias, this bell was poured with too much attention. The Elias frowned. Is that possible? Attention, the pastor replied, is a kind of heat, and heat changes things. In the Foundry ledger, Jonah wrote without flourish, tone true, behavior irregular. The notation was tidy, unalarmed, but something had shifted. The bell had announced itself as more than an instrument. It was a clock of another order, one that did not measure hours but endings. And in that parish, where the river held secrets in its brown currents and the cypress roots curled like fists under the water, the people understood, not all clocks hang on walls. Some hang above us in the air, waiting to sound at the appointed time. And when they do, no one dares to ask who set them. By lamplight, the ledger looked like a kind of order the earth could not ruin. The pages were thick, almost cloth, their edges furred by humidity and thumb. Elias kept it dry under oiled canvas and opened it with the care a man reserves for a wound he believes is healing. It was not a diary, not a confession. It was discipline. Tallies, costs, wages. Time sorted into columns as if fate could be balanced like accounts. Your hand is steady, Mrs. Delahaye said, standing in the doorway with river mist clinging to her shawl. Her husband ran the ferry. She knew schedules and the weight of names. I envy men who can make lines behave. Elias offered a small smile. Lines behave when you frighten them with math. She leaned closer. May I? He turned the ledger so the light lay kindly on the page. She ran a finger along the columns and stopped where the page had been folded down. Her nail tapped a name. Robichaud, with a date that should have been next week, and a quantity written, half erased, then rewritten. Disorder, she murmured. He came to me this morning to ask the toll across. But here he is before. It's a mistaken hand, Elias said, the words flat and too quick. Charcoal smudges. I'll correct it. Her eyes lingered on the neat line struck through the old number and the new one, written beside it as if corrected by a man who had overheard tomorrow. She stepped back, the ferry bell in her mind undoubtedly ringing its short syllables. Be careful what keeps your time, she said, and left. That night Elias sat with the ledger open and the room smelling of tallow and coal. Outside, the bayou shifted like a sleeper. He crossed out a line, rewrote a quantity, and felt the peculiar guilt of a man who's edited his own past. Stop fussing it, Jonah said from the doorway, hair damp with night air. It's a book, not a conscience. It is when men eat by it, Elias answered, and when it argues with me. He did not tell Jonah about the page he'd already turned down in quiet dread, an order in Durant's name written for Tuesday, though Durant had not yet darkened their threshold, nor about the single word he'd penned and then crossed out beneath it, unavailable as if he'd been dictated to by a mouth he didn't trust. By week's end, the habit grew teeth. Names no longer kept to their lines. Orders appeared too, sometimes 3 days before the men arrived, the handwriting unmistakably his own. Quantities altered overnight, sometimes in favor of profit, sometimes loss. It favored neither and therefore worried everyone. Who's changing it? Ephraim asked, eyes bright with a kind of fear that feels like discovery. I am, Elias said. Or I did, or I don't remember doing it. Jonah watched him. Pick one. I can't. So Jonah began keeping a second book, hidden beneath the bench vise where oil dripped slow as thought. No sums, no charges, only descriptions, written as if making a list of pests to be dealt with. Stove door shut with no draught. Mulder claims to hear cough inside casting. Lardle found tilted. Protocol broken. Responsible party unknown. Bell self-initiates thrice when barge wrecks upriver. Smear of soot. Mouth shaped. His script slowed across the page, letters careful like a man learning to sound out a prayer in a language not his own. He recorded hours, the shape of the weather, the dampness of wood stacked by the furnace. He noted the wind's direction and the peculiar silence when it swung east. Elias saw the book one night and closed the ledger as if modesty still applied. "You think naming it will tame it?" Jonah fixed him with a look. "I don't think anything tames anything. But I want to know what I saw when someone tells me I didn't." News of the second book traveled the parish the way all news travels there, through hair being cut, bread being bought, a hand on a shoulder that lingers too long. By the time Sunday arrived, it had a name. "They keep a black almanac. Down there," a woman whispered in the churchyard, eyes on the Winslows' bowed heads. "Writes the future like a weather chart." The pastor stopped them after Mass. In the cool dim of the nave where candle smoke drew thin lines into the rafters, he placed his hand on the ledger's cover when Elias, defensive, brought it as a kind of defense. "A book is not an oracle," the pastor said. "Then why does it speak in dates we haven't lived?" Elias asked. "The soul speaks in its own calendars," the pastor replied. "Sometimes paper listens." At the ferry, Mrs. Delahaye began refusing to carry the ledger across river, even wrapped. "Ink and water breed mistakes," she told Ephraim, "and other small lives." "What kind?" he asked. "The kind that crawl out at night and add a line where no line should be." Down in the Foundry, a different arithmetic took hold. A man whose name was crossed out on Tuesday failed to show his face until Friday, claiming a fever that had broken as quickly as it had come. Another order, halved in the book and doubled again with a trembling hand, arrived with the buyer's apology already in his mouth. "I meant 5, he confessed, "not 10. Don't know why I said 10. "You didn't," Elias said softly, then wished he hadn't. At dusk, the ledger sat under lamplight like an animal pretending sleep. Mice scuttled in the rafters. The clock, a cheap one with a painted face of roses, ticked as if deciding not to stop. Elias ran a thumb along the spine and whispered into the stillness, to no one at all. "What does it mean when the record knows you better than you know yourself?" Jonah, somewhere in the darkness beyond the doorway, answered without stepping into the light. "It means you've been measured by something that doesn't care for coin." Elias closed the ledger. The room exhaled. Outside, the bayou turned in its bed. And in the books, one of money, one of behavior. The lines waited, as if thirst could make a mirror drink first. There is a season in every parish when gossip changes its weight, when it ceases to be a pastime and hardens into a kind of weapon. That season came quietly to the bayou, borne in on the damp air with the smell of coal and rain. It began after the second incident of the bell, after word of the ledger's odd revisions, when the Foundry's smoke took on meaning beyond fuel. Women began lighting candles in their front rooms, not for the Virgin or the dead, but for the fire itself, that it might behave. Flames danced in jelly jars along windowsills, tiny wards against whatever heat the Winslows had coaxed into this world. Men, even those who considered crossing themselves the province of funerals and cholera, touched their brows and chests before passing the Foundry gate. Isaiah, a freedman, whose hands looked as if God had intended them for chisels, not flesh, laughed often, the sound ringing like iron on stone. But when dusk approached, he would not step inside. He stood in the yard watching the furnace's breath curl against the darkening sky. "It's learned something from the river," he told Jonah one afternoon. Voice low. "What's that?" Jonah asked, setting down his tongs. Isaiah's eyes narrowed. "It keeps what falls into it, and whispers it back in the wrong season." The parish's church split clean down the center, though politely, as churches do when faith meets the inexplicable. One half called the Foundry a conduit, a passage, not a source. They urged patience, blessings, rituals to soothe whatever unseen current ran through iron and fire. The other half spoke of stains in the brother's past. Stains burned so deep they would not be washed out by holy water, and called for the kind of scrutiny that sounds like devotion when spoken from a pulpit. At the market, both sides traded news as if handling live coals. "Conduit, not culprit," said one, weighing onions in her palm. "Sin leaves marks," said another, folding bread into cloth. Neither seemed eager to test their claim alone at night by the foundry doors. Children, quick to divine treasure in the discarded, began collecting slag shards from the ditch beyond the gate. They slipped the blue-green pieces into pockets, wore them on string around their necks like talismans. Some swore it kept nightmares away. Dogs, with their simpler senses, refused to go near it, skirting the fence on their way to the river as if aware of a current their masters could not feel. The pastor, a man given to caution dressed as ritual, brought a small earthen bowl of holy water to the foundry one morning. Jonah paused his work to watch as he set it on the bench nearest the kiln. "Water remembers too," the pastor said, though his eyes did not leave the furnace mouth. The fire rose, licking the air in a long sigh, and the water in the bowl went still, unnaturally so, its surface flattening as though pressed beneath a clear pane of glass. "Obedience," the pastor murmured. "Even reverence can be coaxed, if you know how to make it listen." Jonah said nothing, but later, when Elias asked about the visit, he described the way the flame had leaned toward the bowl without touching it, and how the room seemed to hold its breath until the pastor had gone. In the back rooms of the parish, women older than the war, older than the rail line, spoke in voices meant for kitchens and parlors, not for the ears of men. "Iron wears ghosts better than wood," one said, fingers shelling beans without pause. "Wood resists. Iron keeps the shape given to it," another answered. "And if the shape you give it isn't yours?" The question sat in the air like smoke. The parish, without quite realizing it, was drawing toward a trial. Not in the court, but in the collective mind, that unlit place where verdicts are returned without evidence. You could feel it in the silences between hammer strikes at the foundry, in the way people paused when they caught sight of the Winslows in the street. The candles knew it first. Their flames stretched taller whenever the brothers passed, as though leaning to get a better look. Reverend Thibodeau for the pulpit, Mr. Thibodeau for the chalkboard. The same man, different uniforms. On Sundays he preached in his stiff black coat. On weekdays he turned that same gravity toward arithmetic and geography in the one-room schoolhouse. Curiosity in his case was not a sin, it was a discipline. He arrived at the foundry one morning with a brass compass that winked in the light and a magnifying glass purchased by post, wrapped in foreign newsprint. "I want to measure it," he told Jonah, setting the compass on the workbench. "Measure what?" Jonah asked. "The way it remembers," Thibodeau said, without smiling. He leaned over each casting with the air of a surveyor charting a new coastline. His fingers brushed the cold surfaces as though they might pulse under his touch. The magnifying glass hung from a chain at his neck, ready to study the tiny crystalline grains of cooled iron the way an astronomer studies constellations. Jonah pretended to be indifferent, standing close enough that his breath moved the needle. The compass quivered, spun, and when it steadied, it did so on a north that leaned just enough to be noticed toward the west. Not enough to call witchcraft, enough to make the room quieter. Thibodeau began chalking diagrams on an old scrap door pulled from the pile outside, circles nested in circles, lines bending ever so slightly, suggesting an alignment that was neither random nor constant. His theory was half-spoken, as though reluctant to be caught in full daylight. The iron, he said, might carry a memory of heat, that it preferred its previous state, resented the cooling, and leaned, even in stillness, toward the fire that had once remade it. Elias came from the corner, ledger under his arm. "Metal doesn't resent anything," he said. "Everything resents something," Thibodeau replied. They searched for the mundane answer first. Hidden filings in the molding sand? None. Coal contaminated with sulfur? Not enough to explain a compass's betrayal. Flux, sifted clean and examined grain by grain. It was Isaiah, never willing to step inside after dark, who brought in the telegraph operator from the depot. A wiry man with a permanent squint, he agreed to take notes in exchange for a bottle of the Winslow's beer. My lines go fainter, he said, tapping the table with one nicotine-stained finger. Whenever your furnace climbs past a certain heat. Define fainter, Elias said. Like a man whispering from a mile off instead of shouting from the next room. So the experiments began. Elias noted the time of each pour in precise columns. Thibodeau recorded the barometric pressure with the solemnity of a priest cataloging sins. The telegraph operator logged his signal strength from the depot, and Isaiah, still keeping his distance, marked down the behavior of the frogs in the ditch, claiming they fell silent whenever the furnace's roar hit its highest pitch. Each man believed his own method would anchor the strange to something measurable, something fixed. But the facts kept sliding. Some days the compass's lean was barely noticeable, a polite deviation like a bow in greeting. Other days, it swiveled half a degree with the stubbornness of a dog refusing to heel. The telegraph lines faded without the furnace being lit. The frogs went quiet under a clear sky. The air in the foundry seemed to shift weight from one side of the room to the other without moving at all. One evening after the others had gone, Thibodeau lingered by the bench. Jonah, wiping his hands on a rag blackened with graphite, asked, "Well, preacher, what's it tell you?" "That matter keeps an orientation," Thibodeau said softly, eyes fixed on the compass needle's lazy drift. "And if it can keep that—" He didn't finish, but Jonah did. "Then it can keep other things." The Reverend nodded once, a tiny movement, as if sealing an understanding neither would put to paper. The question followed them home, not written in ledgers, not charted on scrap doors, but pacing the narrow rooms of their minds like an animal too clever for its cage. If iron could keep the memory of where it had pointed, could it keep something else? A voice, a shape, a moment. The needle's slow betrayal of true north no longer felt like a flaw. It felt like a kindness, a signal, quiet but deliberate, to someone the rest of them had not yet recognized as a witness. The foundry was loud that morning, loud in the way only men pretending not to be nervous can make it. Hammers struck harder than necessary. The grind of the wheel rasped a little too long, and conversation was held in sudden, needless bursts. The air was thick with coal dust and the scent of scorched sand, as though the noise alone could drive out the subtler things that had begun to nest here. Mrs. Robichaud entered without hurry. Black skirts brushed the damp floor, collecting a few stray filings as she passed. She carried no umbrella despite the low drizzle outside, as if the weather had learned better than to touch her. In her hands she held nothing. She was here to take something back. The plowshare lay ready on the bench, edges clean, the metal dark and waiting. When she lifted it, she did so with the careful curve of her arms a woman reserves for an infant, not because it might break, but because she might. Her husband had drowned that past Paz, taken by a flood that swelled in silence and then moved like a thief through the parish. It had been a wordless departure, no last glance, no final grip, leaving socks without partners and tools unwilling to admit new hands. She pressed the plowshare briefly against her cheek. Her eyes softened. "It's warm," she said. Jonah glanced toward the shaded wall where it had sat for hours. The day had been cold in that peculiar Louisiana way, damp, sunless, thick in the lungs. There was no reason for the metal to hold heat. No one argued. Weeks later, on the first clear morning after a run of rain, she took that plow into the field. The earth there was stubborn from months of neglect, sulking in clumps. When the blade met the soil, she swore it leaned just slightly, but enough to arc itself around a buried stone her husband had always spared. He favored ground like a man favors a chair, she told her sister, laughing, not with cheer, but with the astonishment of finding a door in a house you thought you'd already explored. Word came back to the foundry by way of the market, as such things do, folded into casual remarks over onions and flour. Jonah heard it and kept his face still. Elias, when told, only bent deeper over the ledger, his pencil carving perfect, upright numbers as though a crooked line might invite whatever had happened in that field. Then came the smaller stories, the ones people were reluctant to call testimony. The stovetop, cold for hours, clicked once in the middle of the night, as though a finger had tapped it, testing. A gate latch, usually loose, held firm when a child ran toward the road, slowing the little body long enough for a wagon to pass. These were not hauntings as the parish understood them. They were favors, and favors, from something you could not see or repay, unsettled the town in a new way. A cruelty can be resisted, it clarifies the enemy. But kindness from the inexplicable leaves a debt no human knows how to pay. It suggests a ledger of a different kind, one written in movements, in spared accidents, in quiet intercessions. Jonah began avoiding Mrs. Robichaud's gaze in the street, perhaps because he feared she might thank him for something he had not consciously given. Elias responded differently. He sharpened his pencil more often, kept his columns immaculate, as if the discipline of numbers might hold back the seep of strangeness into his careful realm. Still the plow kept leaning. The stove clicked. The gate resisted. It was as though the iron had chosen its loyalties, and they had nothing to do with the men who had shaped it. The pieces wore their affection openly, forged deep into the grain, immune to rust or reason. And in that subtle way the heart of a place can turn without ceremony. The parish shifted. Conversations were softer, meals lasted longer. Yet beneath it all, a question moved like a shadow under water. What do we do with mercy we did not earn? The foundry offered no answer, but in the glow of its fire the metal learned and remembered. Explanations did not creep into the parish. They arrived openly, each dressed in the uniform of its trade, each carrying the calm certainty of its own discipline. The physician came first, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a faint smell of camphor following him into the foundry. He spoke in that brisk tone of a man accustomed to diagnosing fevers and fractures, not mysteries. Grief, he told the men, creates habit where there is none. The mind survives by inventing patterns, the nervous system conspiring with memory to keep you from drowning in noise. Elias stood by the ledger, watching as the physician unpacked a small box from his bag. Inside, under glass, was a lattice of pale threads, the branching architecture of nerves, preserved in yellowed fluid. They'll tell your muscles to twitch when they shouldn't, the physician went on. Tell your eyes to see what the heart needs to see. And if one man claims to hear a cough in the cooling iron, sooner or later the others will hear it too. Shared hallucination is cheaper than admitting you're lost. The pastor's arrival was quieter. He came alone, hat in hand, voice lowered, not for secrecy but for gravity. Standing near the furnace's mouth, he spoke of tests that looked like curses, of God's peculiar habit of using matter to make his points. The bell's 3 unbidden notes, he said, may not be rebellion. They may be instruction. A grammar for mortality, written not in words but in tone. Jonah studied him, unsure whether the pastor's reassurance was meant for the brothers or for himself. And if the lesson isn't learned, Jonah asked. The pastor's eyes flickered toward the dark space above the cooling molds. Lessons have a way of repeating until the pupil disappears. Last came the conjure woman from the edge of town. She was not church and not doctor, yet older than both. Her dress was the color of old tobacco, her bare feet leaving the faintest prints in the foundry dust. She brought with her a small leather pouch, its drawstring frayed, smelling faintly of roots and riverbank. No one asked what was inside. No one wanted the answer. She walked straight to the furnace and knelt, placing the pouch on the bricks. The fire's light slid over her face, catching in the dark of her eyes. "Air," she said softly, "separate yourself from what does not belong." No wind stirred, no shadow moved. But Jonah felt the moment as a shift in pressure, like the air before lightning. When she left, the room remained unchanged, at least in a way the compass could articulate. The furnace still breathed its slow heat, the molds still sat heavy in their frames, the ledger still waited for its next entry, and yet each explanation left its own refracted light. Under the physician's words, the foundry seemed like a symptom, each clang of iron a phantom limb, each breath of steam a trick of a tired mind. Under the pastor's, it became a parable, the flame an alphabet, the cooling metal a set of sermons with no scripture to hold them. Under the conjure woman's, it was neither symptom nor symbol, but a threshold, something crossed by things that came without names. Men began to choose their allegiances, not to truth. Truth had no champion here, but to whichever reasoning brought them the most peace. The physicians slept better on nights when the iron kept talking, as though chatter proved the case for nerves and grief. The pastor's sermons took on a sharper heat, his voice rising in the rafters with a fervor the congregation had never heard before, and the conjure woman began walking by the river each dusk, head tilted slightly, as if listening for a voice she had once mistaken for the wind. We like to believe that the right theory unties the knot, that the rope falls loose, the mystery falls open, and the thing inside is smaller than we feared. But most theories don't open the knot, they only name the rope. And in the Foundry's steady breathing, in the way the iron cooled and seemed to keep its own counsel, the rope was still there, coiled, patient, waiting for someone willing to pull. No story travels far without drawing to it an enemy. And the Winslow brothers' Foundry, with its quiet list of irregularities, had taken on enough weight in the parish mind to attract its own. He came dressed in the sober fabric of common sense. Mr. Durant, owner of a hardware shop on Main Street. His storefront smelled faintly of oilcloth and crates, and of iron made elsewhere, imported with the smug confidence of distance. Durant's wares gleamed with the kind of finish that says nothing of heat or hammer, only of shipping ledgers and invoices. Durant spoke with the precision of a man confident he would not be contradicted. Impurities in the batch, he said. Slag left in the sand. Sloppy men, slower minds. Once, standing on the grocer's porch, he pointed to a faint vein in a stove seam and let his voice carry down the steps. Laziness, he pronounced. Nothing more. The parish did not entirely trust Durant. After all, he sold what others made and kept his hands clean enough to shake without apology. He ate each evening at a table laid by a wife who seemed carved from the idea of a wife rather than from flesh, always composed, never flushed by kitchen heat. Still, his words found a shelf in the minds of the undecided. To him, the tales of bells tolling 3 unbidden notes and plowshares leaning around invisible stones were nothing but indulgent self-mystification in a county with too much heat and too little honest news. Jonah heard it all second-hand at first. Then, directly, superstition spreads like rust, Durant told him one morning in the Mercantile. If your iron's as clean as you claim, prove it. Something in Jonah, some deep seam of pride or challenge was struck. Without looking at his brother, without acknowledging the place in himself where Durant's words had landed, Jonah agreed. Durant sent one of his own men to the Foundry, a watchman, not a helper. He stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, grinning the easy grin of a man who believes patience will deliver him the proof he wants. The poor came and went under his narrow-eyed scrutiny. Molten metal arched cleanly into its molds, without splatter or hesitation. When the castings cooled and the sand was broken away, they emerged without seam, without errant hair, without that unsettling residual warmth. Durant's man went back to town with victory in his pocket. For 8 days afterward, the Foundry behaved. No strange marks surfaced, no cough in the cooling metal. The bell stood silent in the chapel yard, its tongue still and its yoke unmoving. Durant was seen in the doorway of the grocer's, leaning on the post like a farmer on a fence rail, recounting the clean pour to anyone within earshot. The town's shoulders loosened, its stories began to fade back into the familiar rhythms of planting, of rain, of the petty squabbles that keep a place breathing. Ordinary, after all, is a relief one does not know the weight of until it returns. On the 9th night, the bell woke. 3 deliberate notes, evenly spaced. The sound settling into the dark like a verdict. 2 streets over, Mrs. Robichaud was woken not by the bell but by the feel of her plough turning just enough to arc around a buried stone that had not been there the day before. When Durant was told, he laughed a little too loudly, waved the stories away as coincidence, the way a man brushes a fly from his arm. But the parish noticed the difference in his tone. He was no longer explaining away a defect. He was explaining away a kindness. And kindness, coming from the inexplicable, is harder to dismiss than fear. Skepticism is a tonic until it isn't. A rival's accusation can straighten a rumor's spine. can polish the story until it gleams like reason, but it cannot quiet a room that has begun unmistakably to listen back. Election years in the parish had a way of splitting the air into opposing halves. Men who had shared tools or bread now measured one another differently by the color of a ribbon, the shape of a banner, the sound of a name spoken aloud. Streets were louder, though the volume was not joy. It was the clang of neighbors discovering they could be both ally and adversary in the same season. The Foundry, unaligned in public, found itself drafted into the spectacle anyway. Smoke that had once meant nothing but labor became a signal in the sky, and its meaning shifted with the eye that saw it. To one man it was proof the Winslows favored his ticket, to another it was the signature of men loyal only to coin. Rumor, once lazy and aimless, grew a spine and began to walk from porch to porch. Vigilance committees, self-appointed, self-important, practiced their names in mirrors, preparing to sign them at the bottom of warnings no one had asked for. One night in the dry hours before dawn, a different sort of signal rose above the roofline, smoke of the wrong color, sweet as boiling cane. Too sweet. The air thickened until it clung in the mouth. Jonah and Elias, arriving in haste, found the Foundry door pried open like a ribcage. The molds lay overturned, their shapes ruined, the tamped sand scattered ankle-deep across the floor. The sight was not the chaos of accident, it was choice, deliberate, and mean, a vandal's theology, written in grit and scattered tools. Jonah knelt, letting sand fall through his fingers. It made a faint hiss as it landed. "Why?" Elias asked from the doorway. Jonah didn't look up. "Because if you can't unmake the thing itself, you ruin the shape it takes." Nothing living had been lost that night, no men hurt, no metal gone. Yet the damage left a residue heavier than theft. It told the brothers and the town that something here was worth striking, not with argument but with hands. On the back page of the ledger, the one Elias reserved for sentences he would later deny, he wrote in his spare, slanted script, "The town would rather burn a thing than admit it is afraid of it." Jonah did not leave the shop that night. He pulled an old cot close to the furnace wall, the heat sinking into his bones through thin bedding. Beneath the blanket, his hand closed around the hammer's worn hickory handle, a child's talisman in a man's hand. The bell, mercifully or ominously, did not ring. At first light, the street outside was quiet. The air was washed clean in the way it sometimes is after someone has made up their mind to do worse. Jonah was sweeping the doorway when a girl stopped on the path. She wore her hair in 2 plaits, so precise they seemed to shame the geometry of the schoolhouse chalkboard. She held out a sack of biscuits, still warm. "My mother says the iron keeps names," she told him without ceremony. "And if you stop working it, the names forget how to be spelled." Jonah took the bag, unsure if the weight in his hands was gratitude or warning. "What names?" he asked. "All the ones it's already learned," she said, and turned toward the road before he could speak again. Inside the Foundry, the air still smelled faintly of the sugar-sweet smoke. It clung to the overturned molds, to the walls, to the tools left just out of place. The brothers worked in silence, resetting frames, brushing sand from cracks. Outside, the parish moved through its day with the careful step of people who had discovered their own fear and had nowhere to set it down. The smoke from the next pour would rise again into the sky, and whatever its color, someone, somewhere, would see in it exactly what they needed to believe. The break came without ceremony. No sudden strike of disaster, no loud announcement, just a subtle slackening, like a rope loosening in its knot. The orders thinned first. Some claimed the sugar mills were slow in their accounts, tallying receipts before they dared buy again. Others muttered that men feared what their kitchens might play host to if they brought the Winslow's iron through their doors, a hush not about price or quality, but about the quiet things the work seemed to carry. The brothers kept the furnace breathing as best they could. But first, they sold scrap to keep the fire fed. Then a few tools, nothing essential at first, just extras, spares they swore could be done without. Each absence was explained away with the logic of men avoiding the word ending. Slag. Once only a nuisance became its own strange currency. The heat-cooled remnants formed in glassy cakes along the shop's edge, green and blue striations trapped beneath their surfaces like frozen tide pools. The children of the parish began to collect them not as playthings but as wards. They claimed the pieces could guard a pocket from nightmares. Some piled them on windowsills, others tied them to string and hung them by their beds. Did it work? An old man at the store asked, watching a boy clutch a shard like a charm. The clerk shrugged. "Children sleep," he said. And parents dreamed with their eyes open, the way adults do when they wait for the thing they cannot name. Then came the buyer, a traveling man, brisk and deliberate. His eyes swept the shop without interest in the rest, falling quickly on the bell. "Bronze is needed elsewhere," he told Jonah. "A city without this tangle of stories on it. A place where metal can be metal." Jonah stood silent, weighing the words. Perhaps the buyer thought his stillness meant agreement. In truth, it was the quiet a man takes before giving up something he knows he cannot replace. He let it go with a face that did not let go. The day after the bell left, the Foundry's silence was of another kind entirely. Not the pause between strikes, not the sigh of cooling metal. This was the stillness of a choir robbed of its pitch pipe, voices ready but unable to find their beginning. Elias on the steps outside turned the ledger's last few pages. They were filled with numbers that did not seem capable of forcing a future, columns that closed neatly, yet spoke of nothing ahead. From there he learned something particular about failure, that men, when they see it coming, begin to rearrange their regret into shapes that might be mistaken, if viewed from the right distance in the right light, for intention. Jonah stayed inside. He moved more slowly now, no longer matching his steps to the pulse of the furnace. The fire was banked low, smoke lifting from the chimney in threads so thin they dissolved before they reached the roofline. The foundry did not close. That would have been too final, too stark. It did something softer, almost imperceptible. It drifted. The smoke weakened. The metal waited in mute heaps. The sand dried in its boxes, forming a thin crust on top, not yet dust, but no longer alive to the shaping hand. In the street outside, children still traded the blue-green slag, fingers closing around it with private conviction. Inside, the brothers kept their rituals out of habit, the way sailors still tie knots when they know the ship will not sail again. The air in the foundry tasted the same, and yet in its quiet, there was a weight. The soundless knowledge that some endings arrive not with a break, but with the smallest, most polite withdrawal, until what is left is only weight. The parish came to learn that stories, like seeds, prefer small surfaces to take root in. They cling better that way to the edges of doors, to the cool skin of tools, to the glint in a kettle's curve, than they ever could to grand monuments. It began with a stove door that moved upriver with a cousin. Nothing remarkable in the shipping of it, lashed to a wagon, then to a flatboat. But the stories rode with it, quiet in their packing straw. Weeks later, a letter returned. The door had clicked twice one night. Without touch, without draft. The sound came in the narrow pause between a child's breath stopping and starting again. The mother called it a miracle. The father, a trick of settling iron. The child remembered nothing. A gate latch traveled next, sold to a town under the protection of a different saint. Men there swore that one night it resisted the hand of a drunkard who tried to swing it open, the metal yielding only after enough friction had risen to sober his thought. He claimed later it was the cold that stopped him, but others in the tavern shook their heads and said the air had been warm as soup. And then the bell. Ah, the bell. It had gone to a city that prided itself on being too busy, too sensible for rural superstitions. Its new home hung high above a street that hummed with the sound of carts and hawkers, no place for uninvited grammar. Still, one morning at dawn, 3 clear tones slipped from the belfry into the pale sky. The cleric in charge denied it at first, dismissed the rumor as country embellishment, but on the third telling he lowered his voice and admitted he had felt something brush his shoulder, not wind, not cloth, as he passed beneath the still rope. These accounts traveled back as most news did, by letter, by carrier, and through the generous distortions of memory. With each relay, details shifted. A click became a knock. A hesitation became a refusal. A bell rope swayed when no draft touched it. Skeptics shook their heads and called it migration of superstition, not of spirits. The stories hitch rides on the wagons, they said. Nothing else does. But in the quiet spaces, others considered, if iron can hold its shape across miles, why should a story not hold its character? One afternoon, Jonah received a note in an envelope smudged with river damp. It came from Mrs. Robichaud's nephew, now farming a stretch of earth far from the bayou. The plowshare was his name. It had turned, he wrote, just once, around a stump that had not been there the day before. The earth remembers too, the letter concluded. Jonah read it twice. Then a third time, slower. The words had the strange gravity of things that seem obvious only after you've heard them. At the post office, a man known for reading other people's letters when the line moved slow happened to see the note in Jonah's hands. Later he admitted he'd been caught on that same sentence, rolling it in his mouth like a lozenge. There is a humility in admitting that matter may be as stubborn as the heart, that a hinge will keep its small loyalties, that a plow might lean for a man it once knew, that somewhere in the crystalline memory of cooled metal, the weight of a hand can remain long after the hand is gone. Objects traveled, but so did a feeling that the Foundry had manufactured more than stoves, rollers and gates. It had forged, unintentionally, a way of listening, and the sound of that listening was still out there, clicking in kitchens, pausing in fields, ringing in city air where no one had thought to invite it. Years have a way of blurring, especially years composed not of single defining events but of quiet failures and ordinary loves that never make a sound, leaving. What began as the parish's most urgent point of intrigue faded into something softer, as if mystery itself had grown weary of attention. Jonah was the first to go. No announcement, no handshake at the depot, just a morning when his bed stayed cold and a low river fog pressed against the windows. Some said he'd gone upriver, others that he'd returned to the mouth of a smaller bayou where a fisherman owed him a debt. In truth, he likely went back to the water that had always kept a space open for him, its dark patience waiting. Elias stayed longer. A man who believed in balances could not leave until he'd tried to reconcile every column, even the invisible ones. When it became clear that no arithmetic could set the Foundry upright again, he took work keeping someone else's books, numbers that behaved, columns that closed, a ledger without opinions. The Foundry remains, but only in the way a ruin remains, stubbornly and without apology. Half the roof has given in, letting rain pattern the floor where molten metal once hissed in its molds. The chimney leans, its brickwork scarred and scaled from decades of breath. Beneath the debris, the floor is a palimpsest of footsteps, layers of comings and goings baked hard until the individual prints merged into a single unbroken shape, a single large grief. Visitors come sometimes, curious as gulls circling a harbor they will not land in. They step carefully, speak softly, as though afraid the iron might overhear a careless word and hold it against them. No one stays long. The air is heavy with the kind of stillness that makes even the unafraid choose the door sooner than they'd planned. What, in a place like this, can be called truth? Is it the bell that rang 3 times without a hand on the rope? Or the rope itself, perfectly still beneath a silent yoke? Is it the ledger that crossed out names before the men came to place the orders? Or the ink that smudged under the sweat of an honest palm? Is it the widow's plow that favored the patch of earth her husband once spared? Or the stubborn human habit of shaping the world into kindness so we can keep living in it? Each version fits. Each version fails. Perhaps the only certainty is this: heat changes matter, and the heart alike. What is worked hard does not return to its previous shape. The change is not reversible. Iron will not forget the heat that formed it. Neither will the people who stood close enough to feel it on their skin. The Winslow brothers forged iron. The parish forged a story. And somewhere between the two, a third thing took shape, an alloy no smelter could claim, made of equal parts fear and mercy. We call it belief, though it resists any refining into purity. It does not settle, it does not submit to assay. Some nights near the close edge of sleep, those who still live within reach of the river say they hear it, not the furnace, not the hammer, but something softer. 3 tones, low and round as breath in the hours before dawn. The sound of metal, remember it, and in that half-dreaming state, the parish knows what the river knows, that it was once stone, that the stone was once fire, and that we, brief as sparks, are changed by both, whether we wish it or not.
Arief.
With this, the arc of the Winslow brothers, the foundry that forged more than iron, lands exactly where your tone thrives, atmospheric, unresolved, and leaving that faint aftertaste of something still listening.